Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Vice Chairman Emeritus of J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, John Rosenwald.
Good afternoon. As the speaker said, I'm John Rosenwald from J.P. Morgan. Our private bank is a very proud sponsor of this summit, and I want to thank the Concordia team for organizing the event, which focuses all of us on public-private collaboration, something our company considers a very high priority. Indeed, J.P. Morgan has devoted significant resources to programs around the world that revitalize cities, upgrade the skills of workers, and help minority-owned small businesses gain the resources they need to flourish. The revitalization of Detroit illustrates our work. It's been a little over 3 years since J.P. Morgan made a $100 million 5-year commitment to the city of Detroit to accelerate its recovery. In this city, where we've been doing business for more than 80 years, we considered it our responsibility to join hardworking city leaders, nonprofits, and businesses to drive positive change. Indeed, J.P. Morgan is the cover story of the current issue of Fortune, which highlights the impact of our investment in Detroit. And the article, by the way, ranks J.P. Morgan Chase #1 on its Change the World list. We're very proud of that. Just last week, we announced that J.P. Morgan Chase would be investing $40 million over the next 3 years to help create economic opportunity in Chicago's underserved neighborhoods. So we're proud of these initiatives, brings the full resource of J.P. Morgan and our capacities to the table, our people, our data, our relationships, and our expertise. But enough J.P. Morgan commercial. It is now my distinct honor to introduce my friend of over 50 years, Mr. Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce of the United States. Over his 50-year-plus career, this astute value investor has combed the world, seeking out inefficiently priced assets that few others would have the ability or the patience to analyze. Coal mines, steel mills, shipping, banks located in completely depressed economies are typical of the off-the-beaten-path investments frequently included among the assets of the W.L. Ross funds to the benefit of many institutional investors. This unique investment background, I think, equips Mr. Ross particularly well to serve as our Secretary of Commerce. Rest assured, Wilbur will be as comfortable renegotiating the NAFTA agreement or a trade deal with China as he was on Wall Street negotiating the covenant terms of a complex debt instrument. So, as the Trump administration evolves, we are fortunate indeed to have Mr. Ross at the helm of the Department of Commerce, and fortunate as well to have his years of experience and unique set of talents present in President Trump's cabinet room. So now please join me in welcoming to the stage Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, where he will be interviewed by Mr. Matthew Swift, co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Concordia.
All right. Mr. Secretary, welcome to Concordia, and thank you for being here. I'm delighted to be here.
This is a awfully fascinating time. We've got over 70 countries represented here at Concordia, about 3,000 participants over a 2-day period of time. One of the topics that has come up consistently over the last 24 hours has been talking about the impact of technology on the nation's workforce. Talk about that a little bit. What does that, with the state of dialogue about trade, about the agreements that we've had, understanding the impact of machines and what it means for people and opportunity? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, ever since the Industrial Revolution, and maybe even before, people have always worried about capital replacing people, devices replacing individual humans. And many technologies have been disruptive, they will continue to be. But so far, what's really eventuated is that at the end of the day, net jobs are created. They're just different kinds of jobs. What we're going to be faced with soon with the driverless cars and other forms of artificial intelligence is maybe a more massive situation all at once than had been before. I'm told there are something like 3 million adults who make very good livings as over-the-highway truck drivers. That's a very specialized set of skills. Many of them actually own their own trucks or lease them from someone else. So they're kind of small entrepreneurs, but it's unclear, A, whether they'll have the capital to be able to buy the new driverless trucks, and then B, that would be a little weird anyway to obsolete yourself by your own purchase. So that's going to be a particular challenge. Compounded by, think about all the Federal Express trucks, the other kind of delivery trucks that go around the city each day. Presumably, those would be replaced too. And those have been pretty good jobs that don't require even a full high school education. So it will have impact on a very vulnerable segment of our population. Where we think new jobs will come in, all these complicated bits of equipment need people to install them, they need people to maintain them, they need people to provide ongoing services, and those may not require rocket science skills. So the real issue is, how do you modulate the timing effect so that you've got enough educational input so that people can make the necessary changes in their knowledge structure so that they can perform the new tasks. That's a real problem. So Ivanka Trump has organized a very big project, which I'm pretty involved with, called the Workforce of the Future. And we're working with industry, we're working with educators, working with labor to try to figure out how to change the American educational system, because it is not producing people with the right skills for these new tasks. For example, many high schools no longer teach high school physics, high school chemistry, and high school math. Well, that's a handicap as you go into an increasingly technological era. Second, I personally think that in recent years there was far too much emphasis, everybody must get a college degree, and they were evaluating principals and guidance teachers based on how many of their students entered college. That's not the right measure. The right measure should have been how many of the students graduated from college or went immediately into a good job. And the overemphasis on putting people into a college environment inappropriately, I think, is a lot of what resulted in the student loan debt problem. Because there's something like a third of the students entering college 6 years later still don't have a degree. But if they've been on student loan programs, you can be sure they racked up many tens of thousands of dollars of debt. I think the average is around 50,000. So we think there's a mismatch with the educational system, and that has driven big companies to make arrangements with community colleges. Historically, I had been a little squeamish about whether community colleges really served a good purpose, but now that they're integrating programs with big companies, and some of these are fairly mundane, like welding and things like that. Others are computer sciences. So the big companies and community colleges are helping solve the problem. But that's a patchwork quilt. And it's one thing if a General Electric or IBM does it. If you're a guy in a small town, you need 2 welders. You can't really mount a whole college program. So it gets back to, I think the answer longer term is educational reform.
But it's challenging in this political environment where you, to get elected, you can talk a lot about the negatives and perhaps the unfair deal that we have with various trade agreements and all that, but if innovation in the workforce is what's replacing people more than anything, it's not an easy climate for political leaders to come up in that sort of telling people what they don't want to hear.
Well, the Trump administration has been trying to introduce educational reforms. Betsy DeVos has been quite active, and then, as I say, there's this longer-term program that Ivanka is heading up. So we are trying to do it. It's complicated because it's very fragmented. The unions are another whole separate issue. In most statewide elections in most of the states, the teachers' union is usually the largest single contributor. So that creates a very powerful vested interest group that's not necessarily in tune with a lot of these ideas.
Shifting to trade, what is not working in the current NAFTA agreement?
Well, I don't think you have enough time to go into all of it, but there are quite a few things. The rules of origin were well-intentioned. They were meant to limit how much of the content of product that traveled duty-free within the 3 NAFTA countries, how much of that product could come from outside. And it should be limited because when you think about it, the whole idea of the free trade area is to help those within it versus those outside it. Well, they defined the products too narrowly. So in automotive, they made an exact list. This part, this part, this part, certain percentage had to be within NAFTA. But half those parts aren't even used in cars anymore because automotive technology has moved on. And as we get into driverless cars and electric cars, you don't have the same powertrain in electric cars. So it's, first of all, at best, an obsolete agreement. The world has changed so much during the intervening years, shouldn't surprise one that it needs updating. Second, there were whole segments it didn't even deal with. There was no digital economy when NAFTA was put together, so it obviously doesn't have provisions that relate to it. It also didn't do much about services in general, especially not much about financial services. Didn't do anything about telecom, didn't do anything about natural resources. So there were a lot of gaping holes. So part of what's not working is some of the provisions didn't function the way they were meant to. Others just are non-existent. We have to create them. And then third, they had a dispute resolution mechanism, which is complicated, but the net effect of it is that quite often a majority of the panel that adjudicates the trade complaints is composed of people who are the alleged perpetrator. Well, that's not a very interesting concept of judicial balance. So there are a lot of technical issues. It's a 2,500-page agreement, and It'll probably be 3,000 pages if we get to the point where we really address all these issues.
I'd love to shift to China. Is China the greatest threat to the United States?
Well, China is a big threat. It's not only a threat, it's a big presence. Our trade deficit essentially has two sources. One is geographic, and that's China, and the other is product, and that's automotive. If we were trade balance neutral with China and with automotive, we wouldn't have a trade deficit.
Coming back, I want to bring this back to the United States because I think a lot of people in this audience will want to learn a little bit about your take on tax reform. To start, what do you see as the biggest impact on the economy with tax reform? What's the impact?
Oh, tax reform, the key is really the corporate tax rate. We need to get that lower. We are totally non-competitive with other countries. There's no reason we should be the highest tax country in the world in terms of stated rate. Most countries are in the 15 to 20% range. So if we can get within shooting distance of that, we can be pretty competitive. Second related part is to make it much easier for corporations to bring the money back that's now trapped overseas. There's literally trillions of dollars of U.S. corporate earnings trapped offshore because they don't want to pay yet another tax to bring it back. So we need to do that on a very modest tax basis. And many companies have already accrued a higher rate for repatriation than that. So they'll pick up, not only get the cash to where it ought to be, but in many cases they'll pick up an earnings gain.
What's the biggest hurdle you have to get through to achieve tax reform? It's been a complicated, call it rough, legislative cycle.
Well, it's the U.S. Congress, obviously. It has not been able to be very decisive so far. And that's what drove the president to start working in a more bipartisan manner. We'll see if that makes things congeal a little bit better.
One question I'm fascinated to ask you is it hard with all of the media attention the way that it is, and a lot of times coming from a negative perspective, is it hard to do your job in that kind of environment, or does it not impact you as much as people might think?
Well, it impacts you in that it's not fun. But after a while, it's a little like the dentist. You know, you have to go to the dentist. That's also not fun. But you don't have much choice. There is a dentist. You have a dental need. So I think we've become a little bit understanding about its continuity. But the president has his own means of communication through the tweets. And those are a very powerful antidote to what the media says.
So what has surprised you most coming from the private sector, moving to Washington, D.C., becoming a federal employee?
Well, several things have been very interesting about. One, Washington is a wonderfully habitable city. It's a people-scale city and nice wide roads and such as that. Very well maintained for the most part. Very good culture scene, very good restaurant scene, some of which I was aware of, some not so. But most interestingly, it's a very welcoming community. And I think part of it is that other than the local real estate guys, mostly everybody is from somewhere else. So they're more up to assimilating the new batch. And it does help, since it's a one-company town, being fairly high in the one company helps with your social integration.
But I mean, is there anything, taking this job, is there anything that surprised you, anything you assumed that you see different now?
Yeah, I didn't realize quite how process-driven the government is. It's very process-driven, whereas business sector is much less process-driven than it is results-driven. But within it, the nice surprise on the upside, even though the currency there is not money. In the world I used to work in, the currency was currency, it was money. There, the currency is titles, prestige, power, things like that, more or less subjective things. So that's a little different. The whole process of motivating people is a little different from what it is in private sector. But the very good part about it is within this sort of clumsily functioning system, there are lots of very dedicated, very capable, very serious-minded people who are really doing their best to do a good job. So the average quality of this staff surprised me on the upside. Now, it's not homogeneous, just as we have 47,000 employees in the Commerce Department, so obviously you don't have all 47,000 operating at 100%, but a good percentage of them are.
What do you see as, there's a question I always like to ask people on this stage, because I always think it's very telling, but I'm going to make it into two parts. What kept you up at night when you were in the private sector, and what keeps you up at night as the Secretary of Commerce?
Well, private sector, we were doing a lot of intercontinental activities. So there's a lot of late night calls because that's early morning somewhere else. A lot of early morning calls because that's afternoon somewhere else. So,
what worried you the most when you were a CEO, and what worried you the most when you became secretary?
well,
that's the best answer I've ever heard to that question.
Well, I don't know. I don't have a lot of worries in either, to tell you the truth. In private sector, we got a lot of our money from limited partners, so you had to worry about their needs and how well we were meshing with what their objectives were, because increasingly institutional investors, yeah, they still want performance, and that's the basic reason they give you money, but they also now have a lot of social objectives and environmental and things of that sort. So that gets more and more complicated, the relationship there. Here, the hardest thing, I guess, is changes in public opinion and how that affects the behavior of government officials and affects the behavior of the elected officials, the Congress people.
Does that have a big effect on your meetings in other countries with your counterparts?
Not so much directly with that, but it does in terms of the environment within which you're operating. And it has very big budgetary implications. In private sector, you pretty much knew what monies you would have available. Here, every year we have to go to Congress, and Congress doesn't just give the department one big lump sum. They're pretty precise about how they want it spent. So you have much less flexibility with your operating costs. You also have less flexibility in another regard, in that we have a number of individual unions within commerce, and then there's also civil service. So the labor management environment is quite complex.
Mm-hmm. What convinced you to work for President Trump?
Well, I worked hard to get him elected, and once he got elected, I wanted to do my best to make sure he would succeed.
But what initiated your original support of his campaign? What was it that you saw?
Well, I knew him for a long time. We actually met under adverse circumstances in that I was on the bondholders' side in the Trump Taj Mahal bankruptcy in Atlantic City. So we met under pretty peculiar circumstances. Because at the time he was having a lot of financial troubles. Now, he came out of it extremely well and went on to do very, very well. But we met him under that environment, and I was very impressed with how well he handled himself. When you meet people who are under tremendous financial pressure, under all the stresses and strains, and the public stresses and strains, you really get to see what they're made of. And he was made of much stronger stuff than a lot of the owners and operators of troubled businesses. So Carl Icahn and I were the two big players in that bankruptcy, and if you notice, we both supported him. We both come around and supported him.
Says a lot. Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming to Concordia. It's been an honor to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you. Good to see you.